Deep in Canada's Northwest Territories, there is a river valley so remote, the government once considered leaving it off official maps. The South Nahanni River cuts through towering limestone canyons, past hot springs that steam through winter, beneath waterfalls twice the height of Niagara. It is a place of extraordinary, impossible beauty. It is also a place where people have entered for over a century and never come back out. Not simply lost, not swept away. Something different happened here. Something prospectors and trappers discovered too late. Over 40 years, at least 44 people entered this valley and disappeared. Some were found dead. Some vanished entirely. Several were found without their heads. They called it the Valley of Headless Men. To understand what happened in the Nahanni Valley, you first have to understand the valley itself. Because the place is unlike anywhere else on Earth, and the land goes a long way toward explaining both why so many people were drawn here and why so many of them died. The South Nahanni River begins its journey in the Mackenzie Mountains of the Northwest Territories, high in the subarctic interior of Western Canada. It flows generally northward and eastward for roughly 560 kilometers before emptying into the Liard River near the small community of Nahanni Butte. Along the way, it passes through one of the most geologically dramatic landscapes on the continent. The river carved 4 major canyons over millions of years, each one more imposing than the last. The most famous of these is the first canyon, sometimes called the Gate, where the river squeezes between sheer limestone cliffs that rise more than 1,000 meters above the water. Standing at the bottom and looking up at the canyon walls is an experience that travelers have described, consistently and across more than a century, as being inside something alive. The rock presses in from both sides. The sky becomes a narrow strip of blue or gray overhead. The sound of the river fills everything, all of it, until it is the only sound in the world, and the world seems smaller and stranger than it did before. Virginia Falls, which sits roughly midway through the Nahanni's most dramatic stretch, is the centerpiece of the entire valley and one of the genuinely spectacular geographical features in Canada. The falls drop approximately 92 meters over a 2-stage cataract, with a massive limestone pillar called Mason's Rock, splitting the flow partway down. For comparison, Niagara Falls drops approximately 57 meters. Virginia Falls is not only taller, but substantially more remote, accessible only by small aircraft or by a multi-day journey through wilderness that actively resists human passage. In the early 20th century, when the deaths that would define the valley's reputation were occurring, Virginia Falls had not even been mapped by European surveyors. The men who died in the Nahanni country died in a valley whose most dramatic features were known only to those who had traveled there, by foot and canoe, through country that did not want to be traveled. The falls existed in that era the way things exist in places beyond the map, present and powerful, and entirely indifferent to the human tendency to name and measure and claim. The hot springs of the Nahanni Valley are another feature that confounded early visitors and continues to confound modern ones. There are several thermal spring systems in the valley, the most significant being Rabbit Kettle Hot Springs, and the springs near the area historically known as Deadmen Valley. These springs emerge from the ground at temperatures warm enough to prevent freezing, even in the depths of subarctic winters, creating small pockets of microclimate where the vegetation is noticeably different from the surrounding boreal forest. Early prospectors who stumbled upon these springs in the depths of Canadian winters reported feeling as though they had walked into a dream. The steam rising from the warm pools, the green growth persisting against the snow, the strange warmth against their frozen hands. It was disorienting. Some of them took it as a sign of good things, of life and warmth, in a place where neither should have existed. Others found it unsettling in a way they could not quite put into words. The broader geography of the Nahanni watershed is defined by isolation in a way that is difficult to convey to someone who has not experienced it. The nearest road-accessible community to the heart of the Nahanni wilderness is Fort Liard, and even that is a substantial distance from the most remote sections of the river. In the early 20th century, when many of the deaths that would define the valley's reputation occurred, there were no roads at all, no radio communication, no aircraft. The only way in was by foot, by canoe, or by horse, through hundreds of kilometers of boreal forest, muskeg, and mountain terrain that actively conspired against human movement. A man who was injured in the Nahanni Valley in 1910, seriously injured, with a broken bone or a deep infection, or the kind of wound that a wilderness accident can produce, was a man who was almost certainly going to die there. There was no possibility of rescue in any ordinary sense of the word. There was no one to call. There was no way to signal distress. There was only the valley, and whatever resources the injured man himself could bring to bear, and the outcome of a negotiation between human will and subarctic wilderness, that the wilderness won at least as often as the man. The weather in the Nahanni Valley is another dimension of the landscape's hostility. Winters are brutally cold, with temperatures dropping well below minus 40 degrees Celsius. But the valley also experiences surprisingly warm summers, partly due to the thermal features and partly due to the way the surrounding mountains trap heat. Early accounts describe the valley in summer as almost paradoxically lush, with dense vegetation, warm temperatures, and an abundance of wildlife. Some of the early European visitors and trappers who wrote about the region compared it, fancifully, to a tropical valley hidden in the subarctic. The image of a warm, fertile valley surrounded by frozen wilderness fed into later legends about the Nahanni being somehow outside the normal rules of the Canadian North. The wildlife of the Nahanni Valley includes everything you would expect in subarctic Canada, and several things that surprised early travelers. Grizzly bears are abundant and have historically been among the most significant natural hazards for anyone traveling through the region. Wolves range across the valley in numbers that the isolation has protected from significant human hunting pressure. Woodland caribou move through in seasonal migrations that the indigenous peoples of the region tracked for thousands of years. Moose, Dall sheep on the higher slopes, wolverines, lynx, and a variety of smaller predators and prey animals make up the rest of a food web that functions largely without human interference. The river itself is rich with fish, including a famous population of bull trout and Arctic grayling that fill the clearer tributaries. What is important to understand about all of this, as you settle into the story of what happened here, is that the Nahanni Valley is not simply a dangerous place in the way that many wilderness areas are dangerous. It is a place where the dangers compound upon one another, where the beauty and the hostility are so thoroughly intertwined that they become indistinguishable. Prospectors who came here in the early 20th century were experienced men, hardened by years of work in the Canadian wilderness. They had survived Yukon winters, crossed mountain passes, run dangerous rivers. They were not naive about what they were walking into. And still, they did not come out. Long before any European ever set foot in the Nahanni Valley, the region had been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The history of these peoples, particularly the mysterious and largely vanished group known as the Naha, is inseparable from the story of the valley's violent reputation. The Den peoples of the subarctic have lived in and around the Nahanni watershed for at least 10,000 years, following patterns of seasonal movement that track the migrations of game animals and the cycles of fish runs. The various Dene groups of the region, including the Decho First Nations who continue to inhabit the area today, developed sophisticated cultures precisely adapted to the demands of the subarctic environment. They were expert hunters, trappers, canoe builders, and navigators of a landscape that would kill an unprepared outsider in days, or even hours. The oral traditions of the Dene peoples are rich with stories about the Nahanni Valley. Many of these stories are not primarily about the valley as a place of death, but about it as a place of power, of spiritual significance, and of deep ancestral connection. The falls, the canyons, the hot springs, the mountains above the valley, all of these features appear in Dene oral tradition as places with their own identities, their own histories, and their own demands on the people who pass through them. But woven through the broader Dene oral tradition is a thread that is harder to categorize, a thread that concerns the Naha. The Naha, sometimes spelled Naha'a, were described in the oral histories of neighboring Dene groups as a fierce and mysterious people who lived in the mountains above the valley, descending periodically to raid Dene settlements, and then retreating back into the highlands before any response could be mounted. The name Nahanni, which gives the river and the valley their modern designation, is generally thought to derive from a Dene word meaning something like people over there, far away, or, in some interpretations, enemy aliens, or people of the West. The exact etymology is debated among linguists and historians, but the underlying sense of the word, that it refers to a people who are other, who are beyond the known world, runs through all interpretations. The Naha raids on Dene settlements were described in oral tradition as sudden, violent, and deeply unsettling. They came without warning. They took what they wanted, and sometimes they took people. And then they disappeared back into the mountains and canyons of the Nahanni with a speed and completeness that suggested an intimate knowledge of terrain that the Dene themselves did not fully possess. What makes the Naha genuinely mysterious, and what has fueled speculation for well over a century, is that they appear to have simply vanished at some point in the not-too-distant past. The oral traditions of Dene elders, recorded by early European ethnographers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, consistently describe the Naha as a people who were once known and feared, but who had disappeared within living memory or a few generations back. Some accounts suggested they had been wiped out by disease, the smallpox epidemics that devastated indigenous populations across the continent. Others suggested that warfare, either with Dene groups or among themselves, had destroyed them. A few accounts implied something stranger, that the Naha had retreated so deeply into the Nahanni wilderness that they had simply ceased to be visible to the outside world, existing somewhere in the mountains and canyons where no one had yet thought to look. The disappearance of the Naha became, over time, one of the foundational mysteries layered over the Nahanni Valley. When prospectors and trappers began dying in the valley in the early 20th century, and particularly when the decapitations began to surface as a pattern, early writers and journalists reached for the Naha as an explanation. The idea of a fierce, hidden people, skilled in the terrain, capable of vanishing without trace, and historically disposed toward violence against outsiders, was a natural fit for the deaths that were accumulating in the valley. Whether that explanation has any merit is a question that historians and anthropologists have wrestled with for more than a century, and it is a question we will return to. But for now, it is enough to understand that the Nahanni Valley, even before the first European prospector ever set foot in it, carried the weight of stories about violence, about disappearance, and about the profound danger of going places where you were not meant to go. The Dene peoples who continued to live in the broader Nahanni region after the Naha disappeared were not, it should be said, themselves hostile to outsiders in any systematic way. The historical record shows that Dene communities provided essential assistance to early European travelers and surveyors who came through the region, guiding them through country they could not have navigated alone, sharing food and knowledge, and establishing the kinds of trade relationships that characterized Dene-European contact across much of the Canadian North. The violence that came to define the Nahanni Valley's reputation in the popular imagination was not, by any credible historical account, perpetrated by the Dene peoples of the region. But the shadow of the Naha remained, and when men started dying in the valley, that shadow grew longer. The broader indigenous geography of the Nahanni region is worth spending some time with, because it provides context for how the valley was understood by the people who knew it best, long before it acquired its deadly reputation in the European imagination. For the Dene peoples, the Nahanni was not primarily a place of death or danger, though they understood its dangers as well as anyone. It was a homeland, a place of seasonal camps and fishing sites and hunting grounds and burial places, and sacred locations that had accumulated meaning over thousands of years of continuous habitation. The hot springs were known to indigenous peoples long before European arrival. Archaeological evidence suggests that First Nations people used the thermal spring areas as resting and camping places, particularly during winter travel, when the slightly warmer microclimate offered a degree of relief from the subarctic cold. The springs had names in Dene languages, and in some traditions they were associated with spiritual forces or entities that inhabited the landscape. To the Dene, a place that produced warmth from the frozen earth was not a curiosity or a geological anomaly. It was a feature of a living world, a place where the earth expressed something of its own inner nature, and that expression deserved acknowledgement. Virginia Falls was known and named in the languages of the people who lived near it long before any European surveyor arrived in the region. The enormous waterfall, the thunder of it audible from kilometers away, the spray that could be felt at great distances, the way the water created its own weather system in the canyon below, all of these features would have given the falls a powerful place in any imaginative tradition rooted in deep familiarity with the landscape. The falls did not wait to be discovered. They were already known, already placed within a framework of understanding that the European naming tradition would overlay but could not entirely displace. The caves and sinkholes that pocked the limestone plateau above the river, formed by thousands of years of water dissolving the soluble rock, were known to indigenous travelers as landmarks, and in some cases, as places to be avoided. Karst topography, which is what geologists call the kind of landscape formed when water dissolves limestone, creates terrain that is genuinely dangerous to cross, with sudden sinkholes, underground drainage systems, and unstable ground that can give way without warning. That indigenous people who lived in this landscape for thousands of years developed cultural knowledge about which parts of it were dangerous and which were not seems almost certain, even if the specific content of that knowledge was not necessarily preserved in forms accessible to later outsiders. What the indigenous history of the Nahanni establishes, above everything else, is that this was a place with deep human meaning long before it became a place with a European reputation for mysterious death. The deaths that accumulated in the valley in the early 20th century happened against a backdrop of indigenous history that stretched back to the retreat of the glaciers. Whether that history had any direct connection to the deaths, whether the knowledge or presence or memory of the Naha played any role in what happened to the men who went into the valley looking for gold, is something that the evidence does not allow us to say with certainty. What it does establish is that the Nahanni Valley was never simply empty wilderness waiting to be discovered by European prospectors. It was a place already thick with human history, already carrying its own accumulated weight of story and meaning and, yes, danger. The prospectors who entered it in the years after the Klondike Gold Rush were walking into a landscape that already had its own logic, its own rules, and its own way of dealing with those who did not understand it. To understand why men walked into the Nahanni Valley in the years around the turn of the 20th century, you have to understand what was happening in the world they were walking from. The late 19th and early 20th centuries in the Canadian North were shaped by one overwhelming reality, and that reality was gold. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1896 to 1899 transformed not just the Yukon Territory, but the entire imaginative landscape of northern Canada. When George Carmack, Skookum Jim Mason, and Dawson Charlie discovered gold on Bonanza Creek in August of 1896, they set in motion one of the great mass migrations of the modern era. Within 2 years, more than 100,000 people were attempting to reach the Klondike goldfields by routes that defied belief in their difficulty. Men climbed the Chilkoot Pass in winter, carrying hundreds of kilograms of supplies up a slope so steep it required thousands of steps cut into the ice. They crossed lakes that froze solid and rivers that did not. They built makeshift boats and rafted down rivers that regularly killed them. Most of them found nothing. The easily accessible gold in the Klondike was claimed within weeks of the original discovery becoming public knowledge. By the time the vast majority of gold rushers arrived, the creeks were staked, and the richest ground was already being worked by those who had gotten there first. The great majority of the 100,000 who attempted the journey returned south poorer than they had left, if they returned at all. But the Klondike Gold Rush did something to the imagination of a generation that outlasted its economic reality. It proved, or seemed to prove, that great wealth could be found in the wilderness of northern Canada by men willing to endure extraordinary hardship. The discovery of gold at Nome in Alaska in 1899, at Atlin in northern British Columbia in 1898, and at various other locations across the subarctic, reinforced the idea that the northern wilderness was still full of secrets waiting to be found by the right man at the right time. The South Nahanni River entered this dreamscape through stories and rumors that are themselves difficult to trace to a single origin. There had been reports circulating in the trading posts and saloons of the Canadian North for decades before the Klondike Rush, of gold in the mountains drained by the Nahanni and its tributaries. The Dene peoples of the region had not, for the most part, placed great value on gold in the European sense, but they knew of its presence in the landscape and had, in various trading interactions with European newcomers, mentioned or indicated its presence, without necessarily understanding why this information caused such intense interest. By the early 1900s, the legend of the Nahanni gold was already well established in the informal information networks of the northern prospecting community. It was the kind of story that passed from man to man in remote trading posts, elaborated with each retelling, specific enough to seem credible, but vague enough to be impossible to disprove. There was gold in the mountains above the South Nahanni. Men had found color, the small flakes and specks that promised larger deposits nearby. Someone knew someone who had been there and come back with enough to suggest that going back was worth the risk. The risk was considerable, even by the generous standards of the Klondike era. The South Nahanni River drainage was genuinely remote, substantially more so than the Yukon River system that carried Klondike-bound prospectors north. Reaching the Nahanni required either a long journey up the Liard River from Fort Nelson or Fort Liard, or an overland crossing of mountain terrain that was barely mapped and subject to brutal weather. There were no supply depots along the way, no settlements where a man could resupply or shelter in an emergency. Going to the Nahanni meant going fully into the wilderness, carrying everything you needed, with no safety net of any kind. But men had made similar calculations in the Klondike and come back rich. And so they went to the Nahanni, in small groups and sometimes alone, in the years following the main Klondike Rush. Most of them left no record, beyond a name in a trading post ledger, a mention in a letter home, a brief note in a fur trade company's accounts. They went, and some of them came back, and some of them did not. And the ones who did not added their absence to the growing list of the valley's mysteries. The culture of northern prospecting in this era also created specific conditions that made death more likely and investigation less likely. These were men who operated outside most social institutions, who traveled in small groups or alone, who had no regular contact with family or community, and whose disappearance might not be noticed for months or years. A man who went into the Nahanni Valley in October and failed to emerge in the spring might not be reported missing until the following autumn, when trading post operators began to note his absence from the annual cycle of buying and selling that organized the rhythm of northern life. By then, any evidence of what had happened to him had had a year to be rearranged by weather, by wildlife, by the river itself. The isolation also meant that whatever happened in the valley stayed in the valley. There were no witnesses beyond the wilderness itself, and the wilderness was not talking. Men could die in the Nahanni from any cause, violence or accident or illness, and the circumstances of their deaths would be as hard to establish as the circumstances of any death that occurred in a place with no law enforcement within hundreds of kilometers, no forensic capability, no institutional mechanism for investigating the loss of men who had, in many cases, no official record of their presence in the valley to begin with. Among those who did not come back, two brothers would become the most famous. Their story is the story that started everything. Willie McLoud and Frank McLoud were the sons of Neil McLoud, a trader and factor for the Hudson's Bay Company who had spent most of his adult life in the Canadian North. Their father had come to the Northwest Territories as a young man and stayed, building a life in the trading post world of the late 19th century fur trade. The McLoud family was, by the standards of the time and place, established. Neil McLoud knew the country, knew the peoples who lived in it, and knew the rhythms and dangers of the northern wilderness in the way that only comes from decades of direct experience. Willie and Frank grew up in that world. They learned to travel in bush country, to handle canoes on fast rivers, to read weather and terrain. They were, by all accounts, competent and experienced northern travelers, not naive outsiders stumbling into wilderness they did not understand. When they decided to go to the Nahanni Valley in the early years of the 20th century, they went as men who had reason to believe they could handle what they would find there. The exact year of their first journey to the Nahanni is a matter of some historical uncertainty, but most accounts place it around 1904 or 1905. They were responding to the same rumors of gold in the mountains that were drawing other prospectors to the valley, and they had the additional advantage of their father's connections and knowledge of the region. Neil McLoud had himself traveled through parts of the Nahanni watershed during his years of fur trade work, and he may have had more specific information about the gold potential of the valley than was generally available to outsiders. What happened on this first journey is not entirely clear. Some accounts suggest that Willie and Frank did find evidence of gold, color in the creeks, and perhaps even samples of ore, significant enough to warrant a return trip. Others suggest that the first journey was largely a scouting expedition, aimed at understanding the terrain and planning a more systematic search. What is clear is that they came back from this first trip with enough encouragement to plan a return, and that this plan was the last one either of them would make. They returned to the Nahanni Valley in 1905 or 1906. Accounts differ on the precise year, with a third man who is variously identified in different historical sources as a German prospector. Some accounts give his name as Weiss. Others give a slightly different name, or no name at all. This third companion, whoever he was, would vanish as completely as the brothers themselves, disappearing into the Nahanni without leaving any trace that subsequent investigation was able to recover. They went up the Liard River by canoe, turned north into the South Nahanni, and disappeared into the wilderness that was already acquiring a reputation for swallowing men whole. The journey into the valley would have taken days, possibly weeks, the canoe working against the current of the Liard and then the Nahanni, portaging around the worst of the rapids, camping on sandbars and gravel bars at night with the sound of the river constant around them. It would have been hard work, physically demanding in the way that all serious wilderness travel in that era was physically demanding, but also in the way that serious wilderness travel can be beautiful. The canyon country of the South Nahanni, seen for the first time, is reported by virtually everyone who has described it as genuinely and immediately overwhelming. The scale of it, the walls rising hundreds of meters above the river, the compressed fury of the water in the narrow sections, the sudden openings into broad valleys where the landscape breathes again. These things do not diminish in the telling. The McLoud brothers were traveling through one of the most spectacular landscapes in North America, and they would have known it. For 2 years, nothing was heard from them. In the bush culture of the early 20th century North, 2 years of silence was not immediately alarming. Communication was slow and unreliable. Men on extended prospecting journeys sometimes went a full winter, or even 2, without sending word. Trading posts received news from the interior in irregular bursts, carried by travelers passing through, and the absence of news was not the same as news of disaster. But by the time 2 full years had passed without any word from the McLoud brothers, the silence had become impossible to ignore. Their father Neil, drawing on his knowledge of the country and his connections throughout the trading post network, began making inquiries. No one had seen Willie or Frank since they had set out up the Liard River. No one had heard from them. They had not resupplied at any trading post along their route. They had, as far as anyone in the region could determine, simply ceased to exist. Neil McLoud organized a search. In 1908, a group that included at least one of the McLoud's brothers, Charlie McLoud, set out to find what had become of Willie and Frank. They traveled up the South Nahanni River, following the route the brothers would have taken, and they found what the valley had left for them to find. The bodies of Willie and Frank McLoud were discovered on a gravel bar along the South Nahanni River in the area that would later become known as Deadmen Valley. They were lying near the remains of what appeared to have been a campsite, a fire ring, some scattered equipment, the evidence of human habitation in a place where no human habitation remained. The camp was not in any obviously disturbed state, not in the way that a violent struggle leaves a scene disturbed. The brothers lay where they had fallen, or where they had been placed, in a scene that was unnervingly quiet. Their heads were missing. Not their bodies, not their possessions, not their equipment beyond what might have been taken by animals over the years since their deaths. Just their heads. The skulls were gone, leaving the decapitated remains of 2 experienced woodsmen lying by a river in one of the most remote valleys in North America, with no explanation that presented itself to the searchers who found them. The discovery of the McLoud brothers' headless bodies set off a wave of speculation that never entirely subsided. Charlie McLoud, who had led the search party, was left with the task of trying to understand what he was looking at, and he seems to have failed in that task, in the same way that everyone who came after him would fail. The scene simply did not make obvious sense. Wild animals could account for the missing heads in theory. Large carnivores like bears or wolves will consume human remains and scatter bones over a wide area. But there was no other obvious sign of extensive animal depredation that would explain why the heads, and only the heads, were missing, while the rest of the remains lay relatively undisturbed. If bears had found the bodies and fed on them, one would expect much more significant disruption of the remaining bones. scatter across a wider area, evidence of feeding behavior that is difficult to mistake for anything else. The possibility of human violence was obvious, and it was the explanation that immediately captured the imagination of the broader community when news of the discovery began to spread through the Trading Post network. Someone had killed the McLoud brothers. Someone had, for reasons unknown, removed their heads. And that someone was still out there, somewhere in the valley. Because the brothers' German companion was never found at all. He had simply vanished. No body, no equipment, no bones. Nothing that could anchor his fate to any specific location or cause. He had gone into the Nahanni with Willie and Frank McLoud, and whatever the valley had done with them, it had done something different and more complete with him. The search party found some additional items at the camp or nearby that suggested the brothers had experienced some degree of success in their prospecting. A gold pan and some mining equipment were present. Whether there were actual gold samples among the recovered items is a matter of dispute in the historical record, with some accounts suggesting that evidence of gold discovery was found and others making no mention of it at all. The possibility that Willie and Frank had found what they came looking for and had been killed for it was a theory that attached itself to the story early and never entirely let go. The story of the McLoud brothers, when it reached the broader world, which it did through the informal communication networks of the Canadian North, and eventually through journalists and writers who found the whole affair impossible to ignore, carried two features that made it particularly disturbing. The first was the decapitation itself, the removal of the heads from two experienced northern travelers, the deliberateness implied by a detail that ordinary wilderness death or even ordinary violence did not easily explain. The second was the setting, the Nahanni Valley, the remote, beautiful, dangerous valley that was already acquiring a reputation for swallowing men whole. The McLoud brothers died in the right place for a legend to grow around them. And the legend did grow. But first, more men would have to die. Martin Jorgensen arrived in the Nahanni Valley sometime around 1915 or 1916. He was a Scandinavian prospector. The general outline of his life before coming to the Canadian North is sketchy in the historical record, who had been drawn by the same rumors of gold that had taken the McLoud brothers into the valley a decade earlier. By the time Jorgensen arrived, the deaths of Willie and Frank McLoud were known throughout the northern prospecting community. This did not deter him. Men who went to places like the Nahanni in search of gold were not, as a general rule, deterred by the deaths of previous visitors. If anything, the knowledge that men had died there for reasons unknown sometimes sharpened the interest. Where there were mysterious deaths, there was often significant wealth. The two things had a way of going together in the stories that circulated through the Canadian North. Jorgensen spent time in the valley in what appears to have been a reasonably systematic way. He built a cabin, which suggested an intention to overwinter, and he conducted prospecting work in the area. His cabin was located in the general region of Deadmen Valley, the same stretch of river where the McLoud brothers had been found years before. This was not entirely coincidental. The area of the valley where the McLouds died was also the area that various prospectors believed held the best mineral potential, and the existence of the McLouds' old camp may have served as a kind of landmark for later arrivals, a bearing point in country without many landmarks that outsiders could trust. In 1917, Martin Jorgensen was found dead in the ruins of his burned cabin. His head was missing. The discovery of Jorgensen's headless body in the burned cabin was, if anything, even more disturbing than the discovery of the McLoud brothers a decade earlier. The burned cabin added a dimension of deliberateness to the scene that was hard to explain away. Cabins do not spontaneously combust in the normal course of wilderness events. Fire is possible, of course, from an overturned lantern or an unattended stove, or any of the other domestic accidents that killed people in the era before fire safety was a serious consideration. But the combination of a burned cabin and a headless body pushed the scene firmly into the territory of intentional violence in the minds of everyone who heard about it. Who had burned the cabin? Who had taken Jorgensen's head? Why would anyone remove a dead man's head in the first place? These questions, which had followed the McLoud brothers' story for nearly a decade, now attached themselves to Jorgensen's death and acquired an additional layer of urgency. 2 incidents of decapitation in the same valley, a decade apart, involving different men. This was not coincidence. This was pattern. The story of Phil Powers, who died in the valley in 1931, adds another layer to the accumulating mystery. Powers was a prospector and trapper who had been working in the Nahanni country for some time. He was found dead in his own cabin, which had been burned to the ground, in circumstances that strongly echoed the death of Martin Jorgensen 14 years earlier. The burned cabin, the isolated location, the dead man inside. Powers' death does differ from the others in some accounts, which attribute it to natural causes or accident rather than to violence, explaining the burned cabin as an accidental fire rather than deliberate destruction. But the location, the timing, and the general atmosphere surrounding his death contributed to the accumulating mythology of the valley, regardless of the specific circumstances. The story of the Nahanni was being written in layers, and each new death, whatever its actual cause, added to the general impression that the valley was a place where men went and died in ways that defied ordinary explanation. The cases of John O'Brien and Angus Hall, both of whom died in the Nahanni country in the 1930s, follow patterns that are now familiar. O'Brien was found frozen to death in his sleeping bag in circumstances that raised immediate questions. A man with his experience in the northern wilderness, in a sleeping bag, frozen to death in a location where he should have had access to wood for fire and the skills to use it, was an outcome that did not quite fit the straightforward accident narrative. Hall vanished entirely, never found dead or alive, his fate joining the list of the valley's unanswered questions. It is worth stepping back at this point to consider these deaths as a collection, because the collection is what matters for understanding how the Nahanni Valley's reputation was constructed. Individual deaths in wilderness areas, while tragic, are not unusual. The Canadian North in the first half of the 20th century was a place where men died regularly from cold, from drowning, from animal attack, from accident, from disease, from violence. The mortality rate among northern prospectors and trappers was not low. What distinguished the Nahanni deaths from the general background of wilderness fatality was the specific, repeated details: the decapitations, the burned cabins, the clustering in a specific valley over a specific period of time, the absence of credible explanations. These details, taken together, created something more than the sum of individual tragedies. They created a narrative, and that narrative had the essential quality of a good horror story. It was specific enough to seem real, mysterious enough to defy resolution, and located in a real place that anyone with enough determination and foolishness could actually go to. There were other deaths too, less dramatic in their circumstances, but no less final. Men who went into the valley in good health and were found dead of apparent illness with no obvious cause. Men who drowned in the river in sections that experienced travelers should have navigated without difficulty. Men who simply walked into the wilderness and were never seen again, absorbed by the country as completely as if they had never existed. The valley was adding to its collection, and nobody could stop it. The specific stretch of the South Nahanni River where the McLoud brothers were found, and where several subsequent deaths and disappearances were concentrated, acquired its own name in the years following the discovery of their bodies: Deadmen Valley is a broad, relatively flat section of the river between the canyon systems, a place where the tight walls of the canyons relax their grip and the valley opens up into something that almost resembles ordinary landscape. It is, by all accounts, beautiful in the way that broad river valleys in the mountains are beautiful, with the peaks rising on either side and the river winding through meadows and spruce forest and gravel bars that the water shapes and reshapes with every flood. It is also, as its name announces, a place that carries a specific history of violent or mysterious death. The name Deadmen Valley became attached to this stretch of river sometime in the years after the McLoud brothers' discovery, and it was well established in the informal geographical knowledge of the northern prospecting community before it appeared in any printed source. Names like this, informal and expressive, spread through oral networks in northern communities with a speed and persistence that formal cartography could not match. The name itself is a small piece of evidence about how the people who knew the valley best understood it. They did not name it for its beauty, though the beauty was real and acknowledged. They named it for its dead. The valley had earned its name through a specific pattern of deaths, and the people who used the name every day were people who understood, in the straightforward way of those who work in dangerous places, that the pattern was not coincidence. Whether the name preceded or followed the most dramatic deaths is hard to say with certainty. Place names in remote wilderness areas often develop through processes that leave no written record, accumulating significance gradually through the stories told about them until the name and the story become inseparable. By the time Deadmen Valley appeared in print, it was already a name with a long history behind it, a name that had been spoken in trading posts and trappers' cabins and prospectors' camps, long before any journalist arrived to write it down. The geography of Deadmen Valley also has some specific features that contributed to the deaths associated with it. The stretch of river is sandwiched between canyon sections that, in high water, are genuinely impassable for the kinds of boats available to early 20th century travelers. A man who entered Deadmen Valley when the river was rising could find himself cut off from both upstream and downstream exit routes, trapped in the valley by water levels that turn the canyon approaches into killers. The combination of isolation, difficult egress, and the natural hazards of a subarctic wilderness made Deadmen Valley a place where the margin between survival and death was thinner than in many other remote locations. The hot springs near Deadmen Valley also contribute to the landscape's strangeness. The warm seeps and springs that dot this section of the valley floor create patches of unusual vegetation and persistent warmth that early visitors described in terms that blended admiration with unease. A place that was warm and green in a country that was cold and bare had a quality of wrongness to it, a suggestion that the ordinary rules did not apply here. Men who had spent weeks or months in the subarctic cold, with its constant reminder that the wilderness was indifferent or hostile to human life, found the warmth of the springs disorienting in ways they found it hard to articulate. The springs seemed to say that the valley had its own climate, its own rules, its own relationship with the seasons. And if it had its own relationship with the seasons, perhaps it had its own relationship with the people who entered it. Into this atmosphere of accumulated mystery and rumor came a succession of prospectors and trappers who each added their own thread to the tapestry. Among the most colorful and significant of these was a man named Frank Henderson, who spent considerable time in the Nahanni country in the 1930s, and who became, in the hands of journalists and writers who later sought out his stories, one of the primary sources for the most dramatic and seemingly inexplicable accounts of the valley. Henderson was a genuine northern character, the kind of man who existed in some numbers in the Canadian North of that era. Experienced, self-reliant, full of stories, and operating in a tradition of oral narrative that had its own relationship with factual precision. The accounts attributed to Henderson in the articles and books that began to appear about the Nahanni in the late 1930s and 1940s are vivid and specific in their details, describing strange lights in the valley at night, the sensation of being followed through the wilderness, encounters with unidentified figures glimpsed at the edges of the tree line, and other experiences that fit neatly into a template of supernatural mystery. How much of what Henderson described was accurate observation? How much was embellishment in the tradition of Northern storytelling? And how much was shaped by the imaginative expectations of the journalists who interviewed him is impossible to say with certainty. The culture of Northern prospecting and trapping was saturated with storytelling, with the deliberate cultivation of mystery and danger as a way of marking the wilderness and the men who survived it as special, as beyond the ordinary. Tall tales were not simply entertaining. They were a form of cultural currency, a way of establishing credibility and status in a world where the most impressive thing a man could do was survive. But Henderson's stories, whatever their ultimate accuracy, arrived at a moment when a young journalist named Pierre Berton was looking for exactly the kind of material they provided. Berton would go on to become one of the most celebrated Canadian writers of the 20th century, the author of dozens of books on Canadian history and culture. In 1947, he was a young newspaper journalist working for the Vancouver Sun, and he was assigned to write a feature story about the Nahanni Valley. The piece that Berton wrote, published in 1947, crystallized the narrative of the Nahanni Valley's deadly reputation in a form that reached a mass audience for the first time. Burton was a talented journalist and an instinctive storyteller, and the article he produced wove together the deaths of the McLoud brothers, Martin Jorgensen, Phil Powers, and other victims into a coherent narrative of systematic, mysterious violence set against the backdrop of a remote and beautiful valley. The number 44 appeared in Burton's accounting, attributed to the deaths and disappearances in the valley over roughly 4 decades, and that number has stuck to the story ever since. Whether Burton arrived at 44 through rigorous counting of documented cases, or through a combination of documented cases and more ambiguous reports, is a question that historians have debated. But the number has an almost talismanic quality in the Nahanni mythology. 44 people. 44 lives. A valley that had been collecting the dead for decades. Burton's article gave the valley 2 of the names by which it is still most commonly known. He described it as Headless Valley, in reference to the decapitations that featured in the most dramatic cases, and as Deadmen's Valley, a name that was already in circulation among those who knew the region, but that gained much broader currency through his writing. These names, evocative and bleak, did more work than any dry recitation of facts could have done. They told the reader exactly what kind of place they were reading about, before the article itself had established a single detail. The response to Burton's article was immediate and significant. The story was picked up by newspapers across Canada and the United States. The Nahanni Valley, which had been known to a relatively small community of northern travelers, prospectors, and fur trade workers, suddenly became the subject of national and international fascination. People who had never heard of the South Nahanni River now knew that somewhere in the Canadian wilderness there was a valley where men went and came back without their heads. Several expeditions were organized in the years immediately following the Berton article, some by prospectors still drawn by the gold rumors, some by adventurers attracted by the mystery, and some by journalists and writers looking for their own angle on the story. The results of these expeditions contributed further layers to the legend, without substantially resolving any of its central mysteries. One expedition that deserves particular mention was organized in 1951, when a group that included experienced wilderness travelers set out specifically to investigate the valley's reputation. They traveled through the canyon system, camped in Deadmen Valley, visited the sites of various reported deaths, and returned to civilization with detailed accounts of a beautiful and genuinely dangerous, but not obviously supernatural wilderness. The reports were careful and methodical, noting the real hazards of the river and the terrain, the abundance of bears, the unpredictable weather, the genuine isolation. They did not find anything that explained the decapitations. They did not encounter mysterious figures or unexplained lights. What they found was a river valley of extraordinary natural beauty, in which the conditions for death by misadventure were present in abundance. This kind of sober reportage, accurate and honest as it may have been, competed poorly in the public imagination with the stories of headless bodies and burned cabins that had been circulating for decades. The Nahanni Valley's reputation was not built on balance or nuance. It was built on the specific and dramatic details that made it different from every other dangerous wilderness in Canada. And those details, being real, continued to anchor the story against the pull of rational explanation. Of all the details associated with the deaths in the Nahanni Valley, the one that has proven most resistant to simple explanation is, obviously, the decapitations. The removal of human heads from bodies found in a remote wilderness is not something that ordinary wilderness death explains, and the question of what or who removed the heads has been the central, unresolved mystery of the entire story. There are several categories of explanation that have been proposed over the decades, and it is worth working through them with some care, because each one illuminates a different aspect of what we know and do not know about the deaths. The first and most intuitive explanation is animal predation. Large carnivores, particularly grizzly bears and wolves, do feed on human remains when they encounter them, and their feeding behavior can produce results that look, superficially, like deliberate mutilation. Bears, in particular, have a tendency to focus on the head and face of a prey animal, which contains the brain and other high-calorie material. A bear that finds a human body might prioritize feeding on the head, potentially consuming or carrying away the skull and its contents. This explanation has been advocated by some naturalists and outdoors writers who have looked at the Nahanni deaths, and it has a certain amount of biological plausibility. The valley is full of grizzly bears, and bodies left unattended in the wilderness for any length of time would inevitably attract scavengers. If the McLoud brothers died in camp and their bodies were not discovered for 2 years, as seems to be the case, there would have been considerable time for wildlife to interact with the remains. But the animal predation explanation runs into significant difficulties when examined carefully. The most important of these is that bears feeding on human remains do not typically produce the kind of clean decapitation that the accounts of the Nahanni deaths describe. Bear feeding is messy, extensive, and tends to scatter bones over a wide area. The discovery of headless bodies that are otherwise relatively intact, with the rest of the skeleton or remains present, is not what you would expect from extended wildlife interaction. If bears had found the McLoud brothers in a camp and fed on them over a period of 2 years, there should have been very little left of either of them by the time searchers arrived. The apparent relative intactness of the bodies, noted in at least some accounts of the discovery, is harder to reconcile with years of bear access than the simple missing heads might suggest. There is also the question of the burned cabins. Martin Jorgensen's burned cabin and Phil Powers' burned cabin introduce a dimension that animal predation cannot explain. Animals do not burn cabins. If the burned cabins are connected to the deaths, and the clustering of burned cabins and dead men in the same valley over the same period makes that connection difficult to dismiss, then something beyond animal predation was involved. The second major category of explanation is human violence. Someone killed these men, removed their heads, and in at least some cases, burned the structures in which they had been living. The question then becomes who and why. Several candidate killers have been proposed over the decades. The most historically grounded of these involves the possibility of rivalry between prospectors. The Gold Rush era and its aftermath were periods of significant violence in the Canadian North, not all of it reported or prosecuted. Men who found gold sometimes needed to protect their discoveries from others who wanted to take them. Men who were found to be sitting on valuable mineral deposits sometimes disappeared under circumstances that benefited whoever claimed the ground after them. The possibility that the McLoud brothers, and perhaps Martin Jorgensen and others, were killed by rival prospectors who wanted their gold and their silence is not inherently implausible. The decapitations in this version of events might serve a practical purpose. Without heads, and without the skull's teeth that were the primary means of individual identification in an era before fingerprinting was routine, identifying the dead men would be substantially more difficult. A headless body found in a remote wilderness could be almost anyone. Removing the head was, in this dark calculation, a way of erasing identity and making prosecution for murder substantially more difficult. It is grim reasoning, but it is human reasoning, the kind of cold practicality that serious violence sometimes produces. Against this explanation is the absence of any credible suspect or suspects who were in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge and motivation. The Nahanni Valley in the early 20th century was not densely populated with potential murderers. The community of prospectors and trappers who worked the region was relatively small and interconnected, the kind of community where murder, if not impossible to conceal, was at least difficult to commit without generating some talk. No one was ever seriously suspected, let alone charged, in connection with the Nahanni deaths. No deathbed confession, no overheard boast, no second-hand account of a man who seemed to know too much about what happened in the valley ever surfaced in a form credible enough to advance any investigation. The third category of explanation invokes the Naha, the mysterious people of the Dene oral tradition who had historically raided neighboring groups from the heights above the valley. In this version of events, the Naha had not disappeared at all. They had simply retreated deeper into the mountains, continuing to exist in an inaccessible refuge from which they periodically descended to kill intruders and protect the valley from the incursion of outside prospectors. The decapitations in this framework were culturally meaningful acts, trophies, or warnings, consistent with warrior traditions found in various indigenous cultures around the world. This explanation has obvious appeal as a story. It is dramatic. It connects the deaths to the deep indigenous history of the valley, and it provides a human agent with both the motive and the capability to commit the acts described. But it is very difficult to credit as historical reality. The Naha, if they existed as the Dene oral tradition describes, almost certainly disappeared through processes of disease and disruption, rather than through voluntary retreat into the wilderness. The idea of a viable population of people surviving in complete secrecy in the Nahanni Mountains throughout the 20th century, without leaving any trace that modern exploration or aerial survey could detect, is extraordinarily implausible. The Northwest Territories, while genuinely remote, have been the subject of extensive governmental survey, mineral exploration, and aerial reconnaissance. A hidden community of people would be very difficult to maintain in complete secrecy under those conditions. And yet, the persistence of the Naha theory in the Nahanni mythology is not simply a product of sensationalism or credulity. It reflects a genuine historical truth, which is that there are aspects of the Nahanni deaths that fit badly with any explanation that does not involve deliberate, purposeful human agency. The burned cabins, the specific, repeated removal of heads, the concentration of deaths in a specific area over a specific period of time. These things, taken together, push against the purely natural explanation with a force that is hard to entirely dismiss. While the mysterious and violent explanations for the Nahanni deaths have commanded the most attention, there is a fourth framework that deserves serious consideration. The Nahanni Valley is genuinely, profoundly, almost extravagantly dangerous as a natural environment. Many of the deaths that accumulated in and around the valley over the first half of the 20th century may have been exactly what they appear to be at first glance: wilderness deaths, caused by the exceptional hazards of a particular place, with the more dramatic elements, the decapitations, the burned cabins, adding layers of mystery that make the ordinary deaths look more sinister than they are. The South Nahanni River itself is one of the most dangerous whitewater rivers in North America. Its canyon sections contain rapids that would challenge experienced modern kayakers equipped with modern safety equipment. For prospectors in canoes or simple wooden boats, encountering these rapids without prior knowledge of their location or character would have been potentially fatal. The river has claimed numerous lives over the years, many of them in the canyon sections below Virginia Falls, and drowning or injury in rapids could easily produce deaths whose circumstances would be puzzling to rescuers arriving days or weeks later when bodies had been moved by the current and the scene of the accident was far removed from where the victim was eventually found. The water levels of the South Nahanni are also subject to dramatic and rapid variation. The river drains a large watershed that includes high mountain terrain, where snowmelt and summer storms can produce runoff that reaches the lower canyons with terrifying speed. A camp established on a sandbar or low gravel bank during moderate water conditions could be inundated within hours if conditions changed upstream, catching sleeping travelers without warning. Men who had made camp at what seemed like a safe distance from the water's edge in the evening could find themselves fighting the river in the middle of the night, with no opportunity to recover their gear or their orientation before the current took them. Weather in the Nahanni country is another serious hazard that the recorded history of deaths may underrepresent. Storms in the mountains can move in with extraordinary speed, dropping temperatures from bearable to life-threatening in hours. The subarctic winter, which arrives early and leaves late in the Nahanni watershed, is capable of killing unprepared or unlucky travelers in ways that have nothing to do with violence. Hypothermia, which can impair judgment long before it kills the body, has killed experienced wilderness travelers who made bad decisions in the early stages of cold exposure that they would not have made when warm and clear-headed. The bears of the Nahanni Valley deserve extended consideration in their own right. Grizzly bears in the Nahanni country are not the food-conditioned, human-habituated bears of modern national parks, accustomed to the presence of people and shaped by decades of management programs. They are wild bears in a wilderness that has seen very little human activity, bears that have had few opportunities to learn either fear of humans or indifference to them. An encounter with a grizzly bear in the Nahanni country in the early 20th century was, for an unprepared prospector, a potentially fatal event. Bear attacks do not produce the kind of clean, deliberate-seeming decapitation that the accounts of the most dramatic Nahanni deaths describe. But they do produce deaths that can be difficult to explain when the body is found days or weeks later by searchers who did not witness the attack. Partial consumption of remains, scatter of bones, damage to the face and head that could be described, by someone who had reason to believe in more sinister explanations, as something approaching decapitation. The line between bear attack victim found weeks later and mysteriously decapitated man may be narrower than the mythology of the valley suggests. The isolation of the Nahanni Valley also contributed to a specific kind of danger that is easy to overlook. Men who traveled alone or in very small groups into that wilderness had no margin for error. An injury that would be trivial in any inhabited area, a broken leg, a severe cut, a dislocated shoulder, could become fatal in the Nahanni if it occurred far from help. An illness that would resolve with rest and basic care could kill a man alone in the wilderness if it prevented him from gathering food, maintaining his fire, or reaching shelter. The wilderness itself was a set of conditions under which the small misfortunes of ordinary life acquired catastrophic potential. The karst topography of the plateau above the Nahanni River canyons also created hazards specific to that terrain. Sinkholes can appear without warning in limestone country, opening into underground drainage systems that drop tens or hundreds of meters. A traveler crossing the plateau without knowing the terrain, focused on navigation or on the weight of a pack, might step onto ground that looked solid and find it was not. falls into karst features are not recoverable. There is no way to call for help. There is only the darkness of the underground. The burned cabins deserve their own practical consideration as well. In the early 20th century North, cabin fires were not uncommon. Men living alone in remote locations used open flames for heat and cooking, often in poorly ventilated structures with highly flammable materials nearby. An overturned oil lamp, an unattended fire, a stovepipe that overheated and ignited adjacent wood. Any of these could produce a cabin fire that killed its occupant before he could escape, or that burned completely while he was out, destroying his shelter and potentially his life. Finding a burned cabin with human remains inside need not imply arson. It might simply be the result of the ordinary domestic dangers of living alone in a remote wilderness with fire as your only source of heat and light. Whether this kind of prosaic explanation satisfies the demands of the Nahanni story is another question entirely. The mythology of the valley was not built by prosaic explanations. It was built by the accumulation of strange details in a specific place, and by the human tendency to find meaning and pattern in the collection of strange events, even when those events might have independent and mundane explanations. We have worked through 4 broad categories of explanation for the Nahanni deaths. It is worth synthesizing what we know about each of them before moving on to what they collectively tell us about the mystery. The animal predation theory has real biological plausibility, but struggles to account for the specific pattern of the decapitations and the relative intactness of the rest of the remains in at least some cases. It also cannot explain the burned cabins, which are either connected to the deaths or an extraordinary coincidence of timing and location. The rival prospector theory has historical plausibility in the broader context of Gold Rush-era violence, and the motive of concealing identity by removing heads has a cold logic to it. But the complete absence of any credible suspect or suspects, and the long span of time over which the deaths occurred, makes a single criminal or group of criminals active across multiple decades less plausible than it might otherwise seem. The Naha theory is compelling as a story, but barely plausible as history. The idea of a surviving hidden population in the Nahanni Mountains throughout the 20th century runs against everything we know about how remote wilderness in Canada has been explored, surveyed, and documented. If the Naha survived in the Nahanni Highlands into the 20th century, they would almost certainly have left more traces than the mythology allows. The natural causes and misadventure theory is probably the most accurate account of most of the deaths associated with the valley, in the sense that the Nahanni is genuinely dangerous enough to kill experienced travelers without any assistance from human or supernatural agency. But it cannot fully account for the most specific and dramatic details of the most famous cases: the missing heads, the burned cabins, the specific clustering of deaths in a specific place. What seems most likely to anyone who looks at the full body of evidence with clear eyes is that the Nahanni deaths were not a single phenomenon with a single explanation. Some of the deaths were almost certainly natural causes or accidents, wilderness fatalities of the kind that occurred across the Canadian North in the same era without generating lasting mystery. Some may have been violence among men in a lawless context, prospector murders driven by greed and enabled by isolation. The animal depredation explanation probably accounts for the specific appearance of some bodies, including perhaps some of what look like deliberate decapitation. And some things remain genuinely unexplained. The McLoud brothers' heads have never been found or accounted for. Martin Jorgensen's death in a burned cabin with his head missing has never been satisfactorily resolved. The pattern of deaths concentrated in a specific valley over a specific period of time, while not impossible to account for through coincidence and the hazards of the terrain, is striking enough to resist easy dismissal. The Nahanni Valley does not resolve neatly. This is, finally, what makes it the kind of story that has continued to be told for more than a century. It is not a mystery that opens clearly onto a satisfying explanation. It is a mystery that opens onto more mystery, with each layer of investigation revealing new uncertainties and new questions. The 44 deaths that Pierre Berton counted in 1947 sit at the center of a story that cannot be fully closed, cannot be fully explained, and cannot be simply dismissed. It is the perfect wilderness mystery, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. The Nahanni Valley attracted its share of explorers and adventurers who went specifically to investigate its reputation, and their accounts add important texture to our understanding of what the valley was actually like to travel through in the era when the deaths were occurring. One of the most significant early first-hand accounts comes from R.M. Patterson, a British-born adventurer who spent winters in the Nahanni country in 1927 through 1929, and who later wrote about his experiences in a book called Dangerous River. Patterson's account of the valley is vivid, honest, and remarkably clear-eyed about its dangers. He traveled the South Nahanni River in sections, including through the canyon country that had been the site of many of the mysterious deaths, and he encountered conditions that made the valley's lethal reputation entirely credible, without the need for supernatural or criminal explanation. Patterson's book describes the river in a state of flood that turned the canyon sections into roaring channels, where the water level changed several meters within hours as upstream rain reached the narrow gorges. He describes the bears, which he encountered frequently, and which he treated with the careful respect of a man who understood what they were capable of. He describes the isolation, the profound quietness of the country, broken only by the sound of the river and the wind, and the way that quietness could become oppressive over weeks of travel without human contact. What Patterson does not describe in his careful and empirical account is any encounter with mysterious strangers, any evidence of human violence, any of the supernatural or semi-supernatural elements that had attached themselves to the Nahanni mythology by the time he was writing. He found a valley of extraordinary natural beauty and exceptional natural danger. He found a place where a careless or unlucky traveler could die in a dozen different ways. He did not find the Valley of Headless Men. His account is important precisely because it represents a serious attempt to engage with the reality of the place, rather than the mythology. Patterson was not a credulous man, and he was not writing for an audience that wanted ghost stories. He was writing from direct experience, and his direct experience suggested that the Nahanni Valley was dangerous enough, without embellishment, to account for most of the deaths associated with it. The expeditions that followed Burton's 1947 article, attracted by the mythology rather than the gold, added their own contributions. Several journalists and adventurers made the journey in the late 1940s and 1950s, and their accounts contributed to a body of literature about the valley that was substantial by the time Nahanni was designated a National Park Reserve in 1972. One expedition worth noting was organized specifically to search for the McLoud brothers' gold, working from the idea that their deaths had been connected to a significant mineral discovery. The searchers found no gold and no explanation for the deaths. What they did find was a thorough understanding of why the valley had claimed so many lives. The combination of extreme terrain, unpredictable weather, dangerous wildlife, and profound isolation created a place where the margin between survival and death was thin enough to account for many deaths without any help from human violence. The aerial surveys that began in earnest in the 1940s and 50s also contributed to the understanding of the valley. Flying over the Nahanni country for the first time, geologists and government surveyors got their first comprehensive view of the terrain and were able to assess the mineral potential that had drawn prospectors for generations. The surveys revealed a country even more complex and rugged than the ground-level accounts had suggested, with vast areas of karst topography, with cave systems and sinkholes and underground drainage that made the surface terrain genuinely treacherous in ways that a traveller on foot might not appreciate until too late. The aerial view also made clear just how isolated the valley was, how far it was from any source of help or supply, and how easily a small group of travellers could be lost in a country of that scale. Seeing the Nahanni from the air, one could understand for the first time why the valley had been able to swallow men without a trace. It was not that the valley was malevolent, it was that it was enormous and ancient and entirely without concern for the small human figures moving through it. The gold of the Nahanni Valley deserves its own moment here, because the gold, or rather the promise of gold, was the reason most of the men who died in the valley were there in the first place. Understanding the gold story, what was real, what was rumor, and what was manufactured, helps to understand the larger story of why the valley kept attracting visitors despite its deadly reputation. The geological reality of the Nahanni country is that it is a region of diverse and complex mineralogy, with potential for various types of mineral deposit, including gold. Placer gold, the kind of free gold found in stream sediments that could be recovered by prospectors with simple equipment, is present in some of the tributaries of the South Nahanni. The amounts are not spectacular, but they are real. Color, as prospectors called the small particles of gold found in stream panning, can be found in a number of drainages in the broader Nahanni watershed. Whether the McLoud brothers found significant gold in the valley before their deaths is, like so much about the Nahanni story, genuinely uncertain. Some accounts of the discovery of their bodies mention gold-bearing samples found near the campsite. Other accounts make no mention of gold at all. The possibility that they found a significant deposit and were killed to prevent them from claiming it has circulated for more than a century, but it has never been supported by any specific evidence of what that deposit was or where it was located. The legend of the Nahanni gold served, through the decades of the valley's deadly reputation, as both an explanation for the deaths and a continuing inducement for new prospectors to take the risk of entering the valley anyway. If the gold was real and significant enough that men would kill to keep it secret, it was also real and significant enough to be worth looking for. The possibility of finding what the dead men had found and surviving to claim it was the calculation that each new generation of prospectors made when they decided the valley was worth the risk. No significant gold discovery has ever been documented in the Nahanni Valley. The placer occurrences are real but modest. The hard rock potential of the region, while not negligible, has not produced any major deposit. Whatever the McLoud brothers and the other dead men of the Nahanni were looking for, if they were looking for something specific rather than working the general country, it has never been found. This is perhaps the most poignant dimension of the entire Nahanni story. 44 people, by Burton's count, died in a valley that contained no great treasure. The gold that drew them in, that sustained the legend through decades of death and mystery, was a chimera, a rumor that fed on itself and on the human inability to accept that such extraordinary sacrifice could have been made in pursuit of something that was not really there. Or perhaps the gold was not the real point. Perhaps the valley itself was the point, the beauty and the strangeness and the wildness of a place that existed outside ordinary human experience. The men who went to the Nahanni were not all primarily motivated by gold. Some of them were drawn by the adventure, by the desire to go where few men had gone, and to test themselves against a landscape that demanded everything a person had to give. The valley gave them something back for that effort, an encounter with country that was, by universal agreement among those who survived it, unlike anything else on earth. The ones who died gave more than they intended to give, but they gave it in a place of extraordinary power and beauty, and that, perhaps, is worth something in the accounting of what the Nahanni Valley cost, and what it offered in return. As the 20th century progressed, and the mythology of the Nahanni Valley grew ever larger in the Canadian imagination, a more systematic and scientific engagement with the valley also developed. Geologists, ecologists, and naturalists began to study the Nahanni watershed in detail, producing a body of knowledge about the valley's natural systems that both illuminated the mystery and, in some cases, provided new ways of understanding the depths. The geological survey work that began in earnest in the 1940s and continued through the following decades revealed the extraordinary nature of the Nahanni's geological history. The valley sits in a region where the geological processes of mountain building, erosion, and chemical weathering have produced a landscape of rare complexity and variety. The four canyons of the South Nahanni are carved through limestone plateaus that were pushed up by tectonic forces millions of years ago, and the river's cutting action over geological time produced the vertical walls and confined gorges that make the canyon sections so dramatic and so dangerous. The thermal spring systems that punctuate the valley proved, under scientific investigation, to be products of deep circulation of groundwater through rock formations heated by geothermal energy. The Rabbit Kettle Hot Springs, which produce one of the largest tufa mounds in Canada, a travertine formation built up over centuries of mineral-rich water, depositing its dissolved load as it reaches the surface, are a particularly striking example of the valley's geological distinctiveness. The springs at Rabbit Kettle maintain a consistent temperature of around 20 degrees Celsius year-round, warm enough to support plant communities that are wildly incongruous with their subarctic surroundings. The karst topography of the Nahanni Plateau, the limestone terrain above the canyon sections, was mapped in increasing detail by geological surveys that revealed an underground world as complex and dangerous as the surface landscape above it. The caves and sinkholes, formed by water dissolving the soluble limestone rock, extend in some cases hundreds of meters into the earth, connecting to underground river systems that drain through passages inaccessible to human exploration. Surface travel across the karst areas requires careful attention to ground stability in ways that a traveler focused on navigation or prospecting might not appreciate until the ground gave way. The biological surveys that accompanied the geological work documented the remarkable diversity of life in the Nahanni Valley, a diversity that reflected both the valley's isolation and its unusual range of habitats. The thermal spring areas support plant communities more typical of regions far to the south, including species normally found in the temperate forests of southern Canada that persist in the Nahanni's warm microhabitats, while the surrounding boreal forest is dominated by spruce and birch. The ecologists who studied the valley's predator populations contributed important context for understanding the deaths. Grizzly bears in the Nahanni country were documented to range in large territories, often following the river valleys where their food sources were concentrated. The bears' feeding behavior, documented through years of observation and the analysis of remains, showed exactly the kind of comprehensive consumption of large animal carcasses that the animal predation theory of some of the deaths had postulated. Finding a human skeleton in grizzly bear country, months or years after death, might produce a scene that looked dramatically different from how the death actually occurred. What the science told the story of the Nahanni is ultimately a story about complexity. The valley was not a simple place that could be explained by a single theory. It was a place where geological processes produced extraordinary beauty and extraordinary hazard in equal measure, where ecological processes produced a richness of life that included among its members some of the continent's most dangerous predators, where human history had accumulated layers of story and meaning that shaped how every new visitor experienced and interpreted what they found there. The science did not solve the mystery of the decapitated men, but it provided the context in which any credible theory of their deaths had to situate itself. In 1972, the Canadian government made a decision about the Nahanni Valley that would change its relationship with the outside world more fundamentally than any single event since Pierre Berton's article. The government designated the South Nahanni River and its immediate surroundings as a national park reserve, recognizing the valley's extraordinary natural and cultural significance, and beginning the process of formal protection of its landscapes and ecosystems. The designation as Nahanni National Park Reserve was in some ways an acknowledgement of something that had been obvious to anyone who visited the valley with attention. This was a place of genuine natural wonder, comparable to the great protected landscapes of the American West or the Canadian Rockies, but still largely unknown and still carrying the shadow of its deadly reputation. The park designation would, over the following decades, transform the Nahanni from a destination primarily for hardy prospectors, trappers, and adventurers into a place that could be visited by anyone with the resources and determination to reach it. The creation of the park did not happen without controversy or complexity. The Decho First Nations, whose ancestral territory encompassed the Nahanni watershed, had perspectives on the park designation that were not always in alignment with the federal government's approach. The history of Canadian national park creation is substantially a history of the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands, and the Nahanni was no exception to this pattern. The gradual process of negotiation and accommodation between the Decho First Nations and the park administration that unfolded over subsequent decades was an attempt, imperfect and ongoing, to address the rights and interests of the people who had called this landscape home for thousands of years. In 1978, the South Nahanni River was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, becoming one of the first natural areas in the world to receive this designation. The UNESCO recognition described the valley as an outstanding example of geological processes, an area of exceptional natural beauty, and a place of significant natural history. The designation marked the transition of the Nahanni from regional curiosity to internationally recognized natural wonder. The expansion of the park in 2009, which extended its boundaries to encompass the entire watershed of the South Nahanni River and its major tributaries, dramatically increased the protected area and brought significantly more of the Nahanni's landscapes under formal conservation. The expanded park, at approximately 30,000 square kilometers, became one of the largest protected areas in North America. The expansion was the result of years of negotiation involving the Decho First Nations, the territorial and federal governments, and various conservation organizations, and it represented a significant commitment to the long-term protection of one of Canada's most extraordinary natural environments. For travelers who make the journey to the Nahanni today, the experience is one that has been shaped by decades of park management, while retaining the essential qualities that made the valley so compelling and so dangerous in the first place. The river is still the river. The canyons are still the canyons. Virginia Falls still drops its 92 meters over its limestone ledge with a force that can be heard from kilometers away. The bears still range through the valley in numbers that command respect and careful behavior. The deaths associated with the valley's early history are now part of the interpretive story that the park tells its visitors, presented in the context of the valley's full natural and cultural history, rather than as isolated mysteries demanding explanation. The Nahanni is not, in the park's telling of its own story, primarily the Valley of Headless Men. It is Naha, the Decho name for the river, a place of deep indigenous significance and extraordinary natural complexity that happens also to have a history of mysterious deaths that refuses to be entirely explained away. The park receives several thousand visitors a year, most of them arriving by small aircraft at the park's main access point near Virginia Falls, and spending between a few days and a few weeks in the wilderness. The logistics of reaching the Nahanni remain demanding even in the modern era, and the valley retains a remoteness that most of Canada's accessible wilderness has long since lost. There are no roads to the heart of the park. There is no visitor center at Virginia Falls. The infrastructure of the valley is minimal, appropriate to a wilderness that the park is committed to keeping as wilderness. For those who make the journey, the Nahanni delivers exactly what it has always delivered to those who entered it with attention and respect. Extraordinary beauty, extraordinary wildlife, an encounter with a landscape that operates on geological and ecological scales that dwarf human concerns. And, for those who know the history, the constant presence of the stories of the men who did not come back, whose deaths remain unexplained, whose heads remain unaccounted for. Among the most compelling pieces of evidence about the nature of the Nahanni Valley are the accounts of those who survived it. These survivors, the prospectors and trappers and adventurers who went in and came out, who spent seasons in the valley and lived to describe what they found, provide a counterpoint to the deaths that is essential to any honest engagement with the place's history. R.M. Patterson, whose book Dangerous River remains the most thorough first-hand account of extended travel in the Nahanni country, described a valley that was beautiful beyond ordinary description and dangerous beyond ordinary measurement, but that was also, in his experience, a place where a careful and skilled traveler could survive and even flourish. Patterson wintered in the valley, built a cabin, hunted game, prospected along the creek systems, and came to know the rhythms of the country in a way that most visitors never achieved. He found no mysterious murders. He encountered no inexplicable forces. He encountered a wilderness of extraordinary power that demanded full respect and careful attention, and that rewarded those qualities with experiences unavailable anywhere else. Other survivors described the valley in terms that captured its dual nature. The beauty and the danger were inseparable in their accounts, different facets of the same essential quality. The rapids that could kill a man were the same rapids that carved the canyons that took the breath away. The bears that could end a life in seconds were part of the same ecological richness that made the valley alive in a way that heavily managed landscapes could not match. The isolation that made rescue impossible in an emergency was the same isolation that preserved the wilderness from the incursions that had altered every other landscape of comparable quality in North America. The indigenous voices about the valley are among the most instructive. Dene elders who spoke with researchers and journalists in the mid-20th century described the Nahanni in terms that acknowledged its power and its danger, while situating both within a framework of relationship and respect that differed fundamentally from the approach of the prospectors who had died there. The valley was not, in the Dene understanding, simply a dangerous place to be avoided or a rich place to be exploited. It was a living presence with which humans could be in relationship if they approached it correctly, if they paid attention to its rules and showed appropriate respect for its inhabitants, both human and non-human. This indigenous framework is not, of course, a specific explanation for the deaths. It does not tell us who killed the McLoud brothers, or why Martin Jorgensen's cabin burned with his headless body inside. But it does provide a different way of thinking about the relationship between the Nahanni Valley and the humans who entered it. A way that takes the place's power seriously, without reducing that power to simple, supernatural malevolence. The valley killed people in this understanding, not because it was evil, or because it harbored hidden human enemies, but because people approached it without the knowledge and the relationship that made survival possible. They came looking for gold, not understanding the country. They came without the deep familiarity with the terrain, the weather, the animals, and the spiritual geography of the place that would have allowed them to navigate its dangers successfully. They came as strangers, and the valley treated them as strangers, which is to say, as people without the protections that belonging to a place confers. Whether this framework is literally true in any spiritual sense is not the point. As an account of why the valley killed disproportionately many of the outsiders who entered it, while supporting the lives of the indigenous peoples who had always lived there, it captures something real about the relationship between knowledge, respect, and survival in a genuinely demanding environment. The Nahanni Valley's place in the Canadian imagination has evolved considerably over the century and more since the first mysterious deaths brought it to public attention. The Valley of Headless Men image, so powerful in the mid-20th century journalism that crystallized the legend, has gradually given way to a more complex picture that acknowledges the valley's indigenous history, its extraordinary natural significance, and its complicated relationship with the stories that were built around it. The park system, the UNESCO designation, and the gradual development of a more sophisticated popular understanding of Canadian Indigenous history have all contributed to this shift. Modern visitors to the Nahanni are as likely to encounter the park's interpretation of Dene history and the ecological significance of the thermal springs as they are to encounter the stories of headless prospectors, though both threads remain present in any complete account of the valley. But the mythology of the Valley of Headless Men has not disappeared, and probably never will. It is too good a story, too specific in its dramatic details, too firmly anchored in real events and a real place, to fade from the imagination. The deaths were real. The decapitations were real. The burned cabins were real. The 44 lives that Burton counted were real lives, even if the precise count is subject to historical debate. These things happened, and their having happened in one of the most beautiful and remote valleys in North America gives them a power that ordinary wilderness tragedy does not have. The story continues to attract writers, filmmakers, podcasters, and ordinary curious people who find in the Nahanni Valley's history the particular quality of a mystery that is grounded in reality and still unresolved. The ongoing absence of any definitive explanation for the most dramatic deaths maintains the story's appeal in a way that a solved mystery could not. We live in an age when most mysteries are quickly resolved by the tools of digital investigation, genetic analysis, and institutional record-keeping. The Nahanni murders, if that is what they were, predate all of those tools and left no DNA evidence, no digital records, no surviving witnesses. They are mysteries from an era when mystery was still possible, in a way it rarely is today. This temporal specificity is part of what gives the Nahanni story its particular quality. It belongs to a world that no longer exists, a world of remote wilderness, accessible only by canoe and footwork, of prospectors living and dying beyond any reach of law or assistance, of indigenous peoples navigating the collision of their ancient traditions with the demands of modernity. That world is gone, but its traces remain in the river canyons and the hot springs and the places where men died without explanation and were found, when they were found at all, without their heads. Every great mystery teaches something, even when it does not resolve. The Nahanni Valley, across the more than a century of deaths and stories and investigations and legends that have accumulated around it, teaches several things that are worth drawing out before we reach the end of this account. The first is about the nature of wilderness itself. The Nahanni Valley is one of the genuine wilderness areas remaining in North America, a place where the natural systems function largely without human management or intervention, where the animals are wild in the complete sense of the word, where the geological and ecological processes that shape the landscape continue to operate on their own terms. In such a place, the ordinary human expectation of safety, of a world organized for human survival, does not apply. The valley does not accommodate human weakness or carelessness. It does not forgive mistakes. It is not arranged for human convenience. This is not a criticism. It is a description of something genuinely valuable. In a world in which most of the Earth's surface has been shaped by and for human use, a place that still operates according to its own logic is precious. The Nahanni Valley's danger is inseparable from its wildness, and its wildness is what makes it worth preserving. The 44 deaths are part of the cost of having a place in the world that is not for us, that operates according to principles we did not make and cannot fully understand. The second thing the Valley teaches is about the nature of stories and their relationship to truth. The story of the Valley of Headless Men is not a lie, but it is also not simply the truth. It is a construction built from real events, shaped by the imaginative needs of the people who told it, elaborated by journalism and popular culture, and serving a variety of purposes that are not always aligned with accurate historical understanding. Understanding how the story was built, how the deaths of real men in a real place were transformed into the mythology of the Valley of Headless Men, is a lesson in how all stories work. The specific details that stuck, the heads, the burned cabins, the remote and beautiful valley, were not randomly selected from the historical record. They were selected because they did the work that a good mystery story needs, creating an atmosphere of dread, suggesting hidden human agency, anchoring the inexplicable in the concrete. Other details, the ordinary wilderness deaths, the accidents, the simple misadventures of men in a dangerous place, were filtered out because they did not serve the story. This does not make the story worthless or dishonest. Stories that survive a century do so because they are doing something real, capturing something true about the world, even when their specific details are incomplete or shaped by imagination. The Nahanni story captures something true about the capacity of wilderness to be genuinely dangerous, about the history of violence that ran through the gold rush era of the Canadian North, about the deep mystery of a place where human history has accumulated in layers we can read only partially. These truths are real, even when the story that carries them is more than the facts. The third thing the Valley teaches is about patience with mystery. In an age that demands quick explanations and is uncomfortable with the genuinely unknown, the Nahanni Valley offers a model for how to hold a mystery that does not resolve. The decapitations happened. Their cause is unknown. That combination of certainty about the fact and uncertainty about the explanation is uncomfortable. And the discomfort is a useful reminder that not all mysteries are solvable with the tools available to us, and that accepting the limits of our knowledge is a form of honesty that serves us better than forcing unsatisfactory explanations on genuinely unclear events. There is something in the Nahanni story that insists on remaining unresolved, and that insistence is not a failure of investigation. It is a feature of the story itself and of the place. Some places simply do not explain themselves. Some deaths simply do not come with explanations attached. The Nahanni Valley is one of those places, and the men who died in it are among those deaths. And the best we can do, after more than a century of wondering and searching, is to sit with the mystery and let it be what it is. The South Nahanni River flows today as it has always flowed, indifferent to the stories that have accumulated along its banks. The first canyon receives the river and narrows it, the limestone walls compressing centuries of water into a corridor that still takes the breath away. Virginia Falls still drops its 92 meters with the same force it has always had. The spray rising into the air on still days and drifting far downstream, catching the low subarctic light and breaking it into something that drifts rather than falls. The hot springs still steam at Rabbit Kettle and at the springs in Deadmen Valley. Warm fingers of geothermal energy reaching up through the limestone into the subarctic air, green and breathing in country that should by rights be frozen. The bears still range through the valley. The wolves still travel in territories that stretch across hundreds of kilometers of wilderness. The fish still hold in the pools below the falls, and in the clear tributary creeks where the Nahanni's prospectors panned for color 100 and more years ago. The silence of the valley at night is still the same silence that swallowed the sounds of the dying prospectors' fires and the last footsteps of men who walked into the wilderness and did not walk out. The valley keeps its secrets. It has always kept its secrets. The heads of the McLoud brothers, lost somewhere in the forest or the river or the mountains around Deadmen Valley, have not been found. They will probably not be found. The explanation for their removal, for the removed head of Martin Jorgensen, for the burned cabins and the vanished men, and the accumulated strangeness of 44 deaths in a specific valley over a specific period of time, has not been established to the satisfaction of any serious investigator. It probably will not be established. The evidence that would settle the question is gone, decomposed or scattered or buried in terrain that has never been and will never be exhaustively searched. What remains is the valley itself, and the story that the valley carries. The story of people drawn to a beautiful and dangerous place by the promise of wealth and the allure of the unknown, finding in that place something more and stranger than they had bargained for, and paying, in some cases, the final price for the encounter. The story of a landscape that was already thick with human history and human meaning before the first Europeans set foot in it. A landscape that made its own demands on those who entered it and extracted its own payment from those who did not understand its terms. The Nahanni Valley is a place about which it is possible to say, honestly and without embellishment, that something strange happened here. Something that the evidence does not fully explain. Something that the geology and the ecology and the history of gold rush violence and the oral traditions of the Dene peoples and the carefully assembled accounts of survivors all illuminate without resolving. 44 people entered this valley. Some of them came out without their heads. And the valley, flowing on in its limestone canyons under its subarctic sky, has told us as much as it intends to tell. In the evenings, when the light comes down at a low angle through the canyon walls and turns the spray from the falls into something that drifts through the air, the valley is very quiet. The river makes its sound, the low, continuous sound that the river has been making since before there were human ears to hear it. And the forest makes its sound, and the bears move through the spruce without much noise at all. The hot springs steam. The sinkholes wait in the dark plateau above, patient as they have always been. The valley does not need to explain itself. It has been here much longer than the stories, and it will be here much longer than the stories. And the questions that men brought into it in the early 20th century are less significant to the valley than the questions have always been to the men who asked them. Willie McLoud and Frank McLoud are part of this landscape now. Martin Jorgensen is part of it. The unnamed German companion who walked into the Nahanni with the McLoud brothers and was never seen again is part of it. All 44, however you count them, are part of it. The valley absorbed them the way it absorbs everything, completely, without ceremony, without explanation. The river runs north. The canyons hold their silence. The falls continue their long drop into the pool below, where the spray rises and the current carries it downstream, past the places where men camped and died and left their mysteries, past the hot springs and the gravel bars and the limestone walls, toward the Liard River and the country beyond. It is a very old river in a very old land. It was here before the Naha, and it will be here after us. Whatever happened in its valley, whatever it knows that we do not, it is not telling. The South Nahanni River still runs north through the Northwest Territories, through the canyons that no human hand made and no human hand could replicate, past the springs that steam in the winter air and the falls that thunder in the summer darkness. The valley is quiet most of the time. It has always been quiet most of the time. In the summer, when the days are long and the light falls at low angles across the limestone walls of the canyons, the place is so beautiful it can make a person feel, without quite being able to explain why, that they are in the presence of something that matters, something that has been here much longer than human memory, and will be here long after human memory has finished with it, something that has seen many things and keeps its own counsel about what it has seen. The 44, or however many there truly were, came here looking for gold, for adventure, for the thing that wilderness promises and occasionally delivers. Some of them found it. Most of them found something else, the real face of the wilderness, which is not the face of treasure or of danger exactly, but the face of something that does not need us and does not particularly accommodate our presence. The valley does not mourn its dead. Rivers do not mourn. Canyons do not mourn. The hot springs that kept steaming through the winters when the McLoud brothers lay headless on their sandbar are still steaming, still warm, still producing their quiet miracle of heat in the subarctic cold. The Nahanni does not remember its dead in the way that we remember them. It simply continues. And in that continuing, in that absolute indifference to human story, there is something that feels, finally, like the truest answer the valley has to offer to all of our questions. The valley does not know why those men died. The valley does not care why those men died. The valley is the valley, with its own logic and its own time and its own way of being in the world. And the men who came here, however they died, came to a place that was never theirs and never owed them anything. They are part of the story now. They will always be part of the story. And the valley will always be the Nahanni, flowing north in the dark, keeping its secrets, keeping its heads. If you found yourself drifting along the banks of that river tonight, carried by the slow current of the story, then the valley has done what the valley always does. It has drawn you in, held you for a while, and left you with questions it has no intention of answering. Thank you for spending this time in the Valley of Headless Men. Sleep well.